On the 24th of January, 1971, 444 people made their way through snow to a Congress center in a small Swiss mountain town that most of them had never visited before and had no particular reason to return to. They were managers and economists, academics and journalists, drawn from 31 countries by the invitation of a 32-year-old German professor who had written to them in brisk circular letters dispatched from the University of Geneva, with a proposition that was, by any honest measure, modest. He wanted to teach European companies how to compete with American ones. The invitation was not glamorous. Davos in 1971 was a ski resort, charming in a quiet alpine way, with its long sanatorium history and its high cold air, the kind of place Thomas Mann had once chosen as the setting for a novel about disease and time and the slow dissolution of the European order. But it was not the natural venue for anything world historical. There were no snipers on the rooftops. There were no helicopter exclusion zones. The heads of state who would one day arrive on private jets from 3 continents were not there because heads of state had not been invited, because there was no particular reason to think they would want to come. The meeting lasted 2 weeks. Klaus Schwab called it the European Management Symposium. Nobody at the time called it the beginning of anything. 55 years later, it is the most consequential private gathering on Earth. In January of 2025, approximately 3,000 participants registered for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in that same Swiss mountain town. Among them, 65 heads of state and government, 850 chief executives of the world's largest corporations, finance ministers and trade ministers, and central bank governors, and somewhere in the crowd, journalists wearing orange badges that barred them from the rooms where the most important conversations happened. The Swiss army deployed 5,000 troops. Airspace over the valley was closed to civilian traffic. Hotel rooms ran to $3,000 a night, and many of the locals were quietly absent from homes they had contractually agreed to vacate for the week. And ferrying the delegates in from airports up and down the Swiss Alps in January of 2025 were 709 private jets, roughly 1 aircraft for every 4 attendees, at a forum that opened its plenary sessions with speeches about the urgency of the climate crisis. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented record. And the tension contained in it between what the World Economic Forum says and what it does, between what it is and what it is accused of being, between the modest management seminar of 1971 and the architecture of global power that now bears its name, is the story this documentary sets out to examine. Not the myths, the actual thing. Klaus Martin Schwab was born on the 30th of March, 1938, in Ravensburg, a small town in the Baden-Württemberg region of southwestern Germany, and his origins, as we will see, have become one of the most contested and deliberately distorted aspects of the entire WEF mythology, which makes it all the more important to begin with what is actually documented. His father, Eugen Wilhelm Schwab, was the commercial director of the Ravensburg factory of Escher Wyss AG, a Swiss engineering company, and that factory was, during the Second World War, a defense contractor to the Wehrmacht. It used approximately 200 forced laborers, likely drawn from nearby Nazi forced labor camps. A small camp was established on the factory premises. These are documented historical facts, and they matter, though not in the way that the conspiracy versions of this story suggest. But they belong to a later part of this account. Before them comes the man himself, the son, not the father, and what he built. Schwab studied mechanical engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, where he completed both a first degree and a doctorate, then took an economics doctorate at the University of Fribourg, and then, crucially, spent time at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, from which he received a degree in public administration in 1967. At Harvard, he encountered the work of a professor named George C. Lodge, who was developing a body of thought that would later be called stakeholder theory, the argument that a corporation owed obligations not only to its shareholders, but to its employees, its communities, the society that permitted it to operate, and the broader environment in which it was embedded. It was an idea whose time, in 1967, had not yet come in Europe, and Schwab Returning to a chair in business policy at the University of Geneva in 1972, was convinced that the gap between European and American management practice could be closed by importing it. The European Management Symposium of 1971 was designed in its original conception as a teaching event. Schwab wanted to bring the new theories of stakeholder management to the attention of European executives who had not absorbed them at American business schools. That was the whole idea, and in the same year he founded the symposium, he published a textbook on modern enterprise management, in German, aimed at the German-speaking industrial sector, that laid out the philosophical framework he intended to teach. The book and the forum were, from the first, two facets of the same project: to reshape how European capitalism understood its own obligations. What gave the event its particular character from the very beginning was its location. Davos had been chosen partly for logistical reasons. It was accessible, it had a functional Congress center, it was neutral Swiss territory. But it had also been chosen for what neutrality meant in a European context still haunted by 30 years of ideology and reconstruction. Switzerland, with its tradition of hosting international negotiations and its studied detachment from the Cold War's sharper edges, gave the gathering an implicit legitimacy that a German city, or a French one, could not have provided so cleanly in 1971. The mountain setting helped too, in ways that are worth taking seriously. The isolation created a social pressure toward engagement. You were there for the duration. You ate with the people you had been arguing with. The altitude and the snow and the absence of easy exits produced a kind of enforced intimacy that over the years, Schwab and his team would learn to deploy deliberately. The growth was not immediate, but it was steady, and by the middle of the 1970s, it had already begun to exceed the original brief. In 1974, 3 years after that first modest gathering of business executives and academics, Schwab invited political leaders to attend for the first time. The decision was more consequential than it might sound. By adding heads of state and government ministers to a gathering that already included the chief executives of major corporations and the editors of major newspapers, Schwab was collapsing, in a single move, distinctions between spheres of power that most democratic systems assume should remain at least partially separate. Politicians and business leaders had always met, of course, privately, informally, over dinners and in corridors and at the margins of other events. What the European Management Symposium offered was something more formalized, a standing annual venue where that meeting could take place at scale, routinized, recurrent, and wrapped in the institutional weight of an academic and intellectual agenda. The critics of Davos, decades later, would describe this as a design flaw, or something worse. The architects of Davos would call it the point. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the forum expanded its scope year by year, drawing in more regions, more industries, more disciplines, until by 1987, it had grown sufficiently in ambition and in influence that the name European Management Forum had become frankly misleading. In 1987, Schwab renamed it the World Economic Forum. He was, by that point in his late 40s, a full professor in Geneva, and the quiet symposium he had launched in a mountain ski resort had become an institution with its own staff, its own publications, its own network of relationships threading through the executive floors of multinational corporations and the antechambers of government ministries on 5 continents. The renaming was not just a rebrand, it was a statement of intent. And then, in January of 1988, something happened in Davos that no management symposium had any right to produce, something that would define the forum's self-image for decades afterward, and that goes some way toward explaining why 3,000 people continue to descend on that mountain town every January with the seriousness of pilgrims. In 1986 and 1987, Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, both ostensibly allied in the architecture of Western defense, had come to the edge of open conflict. The immediate cause was a dispute over oil drilling rights in the Aegean Sea, where a Turkish research vessel had entered contested waters and Greek military aircraft had scrambled in response, and for a period of weeks the two governments had been conducting the kind of hostile signaling that in other configurations and other centuries had preceded shooting. The diplomatic channels were clogged. The treaty organizations were not solving it. The foreign ministries of both countries were, by most accounts, operating in a register somewhere between rigid and paralyzed. Klaus Schwab brought the prime ministers of Greece and Turkey to the same room. In January of 1988, at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou and Turkish Prime Minister Turgut Özal signed what would be called the Davos Declaration, a mutual commitment to de-escalation, to dialogue, to the lowering of military tension in the Aegean. No public announcement had preceded it. No formal treaty organization had convened it. A private forum, founded to teach European executives about management theory, had quietly accomplished what the formal architecture of international diplomacy had not. Turgut Özal would later tell Schwab directly that war would have been unavoidable without the trust built at Davos. Whether that is the whole story is another matter. The Aegean dispute has never been permanently resolved, and its periodic flare-ups in the decades since suggest that Davos produced a de-escalation, not a settlement. But the de-escalation was real. The declaration was signed. And the question it raised, which the Forum has traded on ever since, is the question that the title of this documentary asks in its bluntest form. If Davos can quietly prevent a war between two NATO allies, what else has it quietly arranged? To understand what the World Economic Forum actually is, as opposed to what its most enthusiastic proponents claim it is, or what its most alarmed critics insist it must be, you have to understand its structure, because its structure is in many ways stranger and more consequential than either the boosters or the conspiracists have managed to communicate. The WEF is not a government. It is not an international organization in the legal sense, despite what some of its own promotional materials have occasionally implied. It is not a corporation. It is, in its formal legal identity, a Swiss not-for-profit foundation, registered under Swiss civil law, headquartered not in Davos but in Cologne, a quiet suburb of Geneva, with additional offices in New York, San Francisco, Beijing, and Tokyo. That foundation status matters because it means the WEF is accountable to Swiss foundation law and to the Swiss Supervisory Authority for Foundations and to essentially no one else. In 2015, the Swiss federal government took the unusual step of granting the WEF a special status under the Swiss Host State Act, a status analogous to, but legally distinct from, the status of a formal international organization. The agreement gave the WEF certain privileges, including protection from Swiss taxation on its activities. It did not make the WEF accountable to any national parliament or to any intergovernmental body or to any democratic constituency in the ordinary sense of that phrase. An academic paper published in the journal Global Policy in 2023 described the WEF's accountability structure as ambiguous and noted that the ambiguity itself, the forum's ability to describe itself as different things in different contexts, now a think tank, now an NGO, now a public-private partnership platform, now an informal diplomatic venue, was part of what made it difficult to assess by any single standard. That is the official answer to what the WEF is. The practical answer requires understanding who pays for it. The World Economic Forum's annual budget runs to more than 240 million Swiss francs, roughly 265 million US dollars, and approximately 9% of that total is generated by the Davos meeting itself. The rest flows in year-round from the forum's membership base of approximately 1,000 large multinational corporations, each of which pays an annual fee that ranges from 60,000 to 600,000 Swiss francs, depending on the tier of access it purchases. At the top of that structure sit roughly 100 companies designated strategic partners, each paying approximately 700,000 francs per year, who are granted not merely attendance at Davos, but a seat at the table when the forum's agenda is being set, access to the private bilateral meetings that take place in hotel suites above and below the main Congress building, and what the forum describes as a collaborative relationship with WEF leadership on the initiatives it chooses to prioritize. The strategic partners in any given year include representatives of the largest oil companies, the largest technology companies, the largest pharmaceutical companies, and the largest global banks. This is not a secret. It is published on the WEF's own website. And it means, as a structural matter, that the institution which convenes the world's political leaders every January to discuss global governance is funded primarily by the corporations over which, in a functioning democratic economy, those political leaders are supposed to exercise regulatory authority. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The WEF does not describe this as a conflict of interest. It describes it as the point. The stakeholder theory that Schwab had absorbed at Harvard and embedded in the forum's founding philosophy holds that the separation between business and government is itself the problem, that the challenges of the modern global economy cannot be solved by any single sector operating in isolation, and that what is needed is precisely the kind of cross-sector convening that Davos provides. Critics, and there are serious credentialed critics of this view, as we will see, describe the same structure rather differently. But to understand the criticism, you first have to understand the machine. The annual meeting in Davos is organized around a visible layer and an invisible one, and the gap between them is where most of the interesting activity occurs. The visible layer is the program of public panels and plenary sessions that fill the Congress Center's formal meeting rooms from Monday through Friday of Forum Week. Hundreds of sessions on climate, trade, digital governance, geopolitical risk, public health, artificial intelligence, and half a dozen other topics, many of them live-streamed on the WEF's own channels, many of them featuring prominent politicians and executives speaking in the measured cadences of people who know they are being recorded. These sessions are the face of Davos that appears in the news coverage, and they are real, and some of them produce genuinely substantive exchanges. But among the people who attend Davos regularly, there is a settled understanding that the public panels are not where the consequential conversations happen. The invisible layer is structured around a badge hierarchy of considerable precision, and understanding that hierarchy is, in practice, understanding what access at Davos actually means. The most basic credential is an orange badge issued to journalists and media representatives, which allows entry to the public panels and the general areas of the Congress Center and blocks access to restricted events in the VIP rooms where senior officials convene. Above that sit white badges, the standard credential for senior executives, government ministers, and high-level delegates, which provide access to most formal sessions but still exclude their bearers from the forum's most restricted settings. At the top of the hierarchy, a white badge with the right insignia, specifically a holographic sticker granting entry to the informal gathering of world economic leaders, known by its acronym IGUWEL, provides access to the closest thing the World Economic Forum has to a genuinely closed meeting within the larger closed meeting, a restricted session attended by finance ministers, trade ministers, senior central bank governors, and select WEF staff, with no media present and no public record of what is discussed. The IGWEL's existence is documented. Its specific outcomes are not. Below and around all of this, companies with strategic partner status rent hotel suites throughout the town, the Steigenberger Belvedere, the Hilton, the Park Hotel, private chalets on the hillside, and operate what are called houses, branded private hospitality venues that serve simultaneously as meeting rooms, dinner party settings, and discrete spaces for bilateral conversations between executives and officials who prefer not to have those conversations in rooms where orange badges might be sitting 3 tables away. Journalists covering Davos have documented consistently that the real deal-making and the real diplomatic contact happen in these private spaces, not in the filmed sessions of the Congress Center. Fortune's insider guides to the meeting, published annually, describe the chalet circuit as a parallel forum operating simultaneously with the official one, invisible to the public record, and, by most accounts, considerably more consequential. That is the machine. Now consider what it has produced. In January of 1992, 2 years after Nelson Mandela's release from 27 years of imprisonment on Robben Island, and 2 years before the first democratic elections that would end apartheid and bring Mandela to the presidency, the World Economic Forum arranged something that the formal diplomatic system had not managed to produce: a room in which Mandela, sitting President F.W. de Klerk, and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi appeared together in public for the first time outside South Africa. It was their first joint international appearance during the transition period, and it occurred at Davos. What was said in the private meetings surrounding that public appearance is not part of the public record. What is documented in Mandela's own subsequent accounts and in the forum's archives is that it happened, and that Schwab facilitated it. In January of 2000, at the World Economic Forum annual meeting, an alliance was formally launched that would go on to vaccinate, by the forum's own reckoning, more than 760 million children over the following 17 years and prevent approximately 13 million deaths. The Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi, was brought into existence at Davos, with founding partners including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. The Gates Foundation's founding pledge was $750 million. This was not a discussion paper or a resolution. It was an institution created at a private annual meeting that would reshape the landscape of global public health for decades. In 1999, the year before Gavi, Schwab had invited UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to Davos to discuss an initiative that would become the UN Global Compact, now the world's largest corporate sustainability platform, with tens of thousands of business signatories committed to human rights, labor, environmental, and anti-corruption principles. The compact was announced in Davos and grew out of conversations that happened there. Whether the compact has meaningfully changed corporate behavior is a genuinely contested question, but its origins in a private forum funded by multinational corporations is not. These are not small things. The difficulty they create, and it is a genuine difficulty, is that they exist alongside the structural accountability problems already described, and they cannot simply be used to cancel each other out. An institution that helped prevent a war in the Aegean and launched a vaccine alliance that saved millions of lives, and that is also funded primarily by corporations seeking access to political leaders who regulate them, and that operates without accountability to any elected body, and that hosts a meeting at which its delegates fly in on 700 private jets while discussing climate emergency. That institution is not easily described in a single moral register, and anyone who tells you it is has probably already decided what they think of it before looking at the evidence. Klaus Schwab would have said, and said repeatedly across 5 decades, that this complexity was the product of design, not of hypocrisy. That the stakeholder model he had been advancing since the early 1970s specifically rejected the idea that any single sector, whether government or business or civil society, could solve the problems of the global economy alone, and that the tensions visible in Davos were the tensions inherent in trying to create a space where all of them could engage with each other. Whether you find that answer satisfying depends, to a significant extent, on how much weight you give to democratic accountability as a precondition for legitimate power. In 2016, Schwab published a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which gave a name to the convergence of artificial intelligence, robotics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and digital connectivity into a single technological wave that he argued was transforming not just the economy, but human identity itself. The book was widely read, translated into dozens of languages, and its central concept was adopted into the policy vocabulary of governments, multilateral institutions, and corporations worldwide. The Business Roundtable, the organization representing the chief executives of America's largest companies, issued a statement in 2019 formally endorsing the stakeholder capitalism framework that Schwab had been advocating for nearly half a century. The European Union's ESG investment frameworks draw on the same intellectual tradition. The World Economic Forum did not invent these ideas, but it provided the institutional machinery through which they moved from academic theory into the language of global policy. None of this is secret, very little of it is known. And then, in the spring and summer of 2020, a document was published that would change the WEF's public profile more dramatically than anything in its previous 50 years. Not because of what the document said, but because of what millions of people convinced each other it said, which was something else entirely. The document was called COVID-19, The Great Reset. It was written by Klaus Schwab and a French economist named Thierry Malloret, and it was released by the WEF in June of 2020. At a moment when the global pandemic had shuttered economies, overwhelmed health systems, and produced a level of institutional disruption that had no peacetime precedent in living memory. The book was, by the standards of its genre, an unremarkable piece of work, a set of policy recommendations urging governments to use the economic disruption caused by the pandemic as an opportunity to restructure their economies along stakeholder capitalism lines, to invest in green infrastructure, to reform inequality, to strengthen international cooperation. Its subtitle was A Post-COVID Reset to a Better World. Its central argument was that the pandemic had exposed the fragility of an economic system built on short-term thinking, and that the recovery presented a chance to build something more resilient. It was, in the language of the policy world, boring. When it was released in June 2020, it was largely ignored. By the end of that year, it had been downloaded, screenshot, and repurposed across social media platforms by millions of people who had never heard of the WEF before and who were, by then, certain that it represented proof of something they had suspected all along. The version of the Great Reset that circulated online in the second half of 2020 bore almost no resemblance to the document Schwab and Malloret had written. In the conspiracy interpretation, the Great Reset was not a policy recommendation, but a pre-planned agenda, not a response to a pandemic, but the purpose of one. A blueprint for world government, for the abolition of private property, for mass surveillance via vaccine-delivered microchips, for a depopulation program whose specific details varied depending on which branch of the theory you had encountered first. Some versions named the architects of this scheme as globalist bureaucrats. Some named specific corporations. Some, in a gesture toward a very old tradition, named Jewish financiers. The phrase most often cited as proof was this: "You will own nothing and you will be happy." It circulated with the WEF logo attached to it, attributed to the Great Reset document as a policy statement, shared with the implication that the world's most powerful institution had let its mask slip, and revealed in those 8 words its true intention for ordinary people. The phrase does not appear in the Great Reset. It is not WEF policy, stated or implied. Its actual origin requires a brief detour. And the detour matters because it illustrates something important about how the most effective modern misinformation operates. In 2016, 4 years before the pandemic, a Danish politician named Ida Auken, a member of the Social Liberal Party, a former environment minister, contributed an essay to the WEF website under the title "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." The essay was a piece of speculative fiction, a first-person thought experiment set in a future where the sharing economy had been extended to its logical extreme, where people rented rather than owned everything, where space was shared, where the environmental footprint of consumption had been radically reduced. Auken framed it explicitly as a thought experiment. The WEF published it as one of hundreds of contributor perspective pieces on its website, and 2 years later, a WEF social media team condensed a list of predictions about 2030 into a video graphic with 8-word cards, one of which read, "You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy." Stripped of its origin, removed from its context, photographed and recirculated in the inflammatory atmosphere of a global pandemic, that sentence became something the Danish MP who wrote it had never intended, and the WEF had never advocated. Auken issued clarifications. Fact-checkers at PolitiFact and Full Fact documented the phrase's actual origin and context in detail. None of it mattered very much. The sentence had already done its work. This is the part the popular story tends to get wrong, and it is worth being precise about what the record actually shows. The error was not in noticing that the WF exists and exercises significant influence. The error was in the leap from that real observation to a fabricated document, a fabricated intention, a fabricated conspiracy, and, in its most dangerous form, a fabricated ethnic explanation for who was behind it. The distance between the World Economic Forum's real accountability deficits and the mythology of the Great Reset is not a small editorial gap. It is the distance between a legitimate political critique and a hoax. To understand how that distance gets crossed, how a real institution with real power becomes the canvas for an invented apocalypse, you have to understand the Young Global Leaders Program, because it is the piece of documented reality that most effectively seeds the conspiracy, and the piece that Schwab himself, in an unguarded moment, described in language that his critics have been quoting ever since. The program began in 1992, the same year the forum facilitated the Mandela de Klerk appearance under the name Global Leaders for Tomorrow. Its purpose was straightforward in concept, if ambitious in scope, to identify individuals under 40 years of age who had demonstrated exceptional promise across business, government, civil society, the arts, and academia, and to bring them into a network exposed to each other, to WEF resources, and to the forum's broader intellectual community, with the explicit aim of shaping how the next generation of global leadership thought about the economy and society. The program was renamed Young Global Leaders in 2004, and over the 3 decades since its founding, it has selected approximately 100 individuals per year, building an alumni community of around 1,400 people spread across the globe. Among the documented alumni of that program are Emmanuel Macron, who became president of France in 2017, Jacinda Ardern, who served as Prime Minister of New Zealand, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and chief executive of Facebook and Meta, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google. These are not obscure names planted in the program quietly after the fact. Their Young Global Leaders affiliations are documented and acknowledged. And then there is Schwab himself, speaking at Harvard's Kennedy School in 2017 at a lecture series on international political economy in a room full of academics, in a moment that was recorded and has since been archived at the Internet Archive. What he said in that room was this: that the World Economic Forum had, over the years, been able to penetrate the cabinets of governments worldwide. He mentioned, as an example, that more than half of the members of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet were, at that point, alumni of the Young Global Leaders program, and he cited similar patterns in Argentina and in France. Schwab said, "We penetrate the cabinets." Those words are real. The recording exists. The fact-checkers got there eventually. Snopes examined the specific claim about the Trudeau cabinet and found it inaccurate. Some ministers were YGL alumni, but not more than half. Trudeau himself was found not to be a documented Young Global Leaders member, despite the widespread assumption that he was. The claim in its specific numerical form did not hold up, but the broader reality behind the claim does not entirely evaporate in the fact-checking. The network is real. Its alumni in government are real. An academic study published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2002 found a statistical association between the density of Young Global Leaders network membership in a given country and the severity of non-pharmaceutical interventions applied during the COVID-19 pandemic, travel restrictions, lockdowns, school closures, though the study's authors were careful to state explicitly that this association did not prove causation, that shared frameworks and shared access were more plausible explanations than coordinated instruction. The study had contested methodology and was not the last word on the question, but it was not nothing. The honest answer to what the Young Global Leaders program represents is something that sits between the WEF's own self-description, a philanthropy of talent development, and the conspiracy interpretation of a global puppet network. What the program provides, most plausibly, is something quieter and in some ways more durable than direct control. A shared vocabulary, a shared set of priorities, a shared sense of which problems are real and which solutions are credible, embedded in a generation of individuals who, having been selected for their exceptional promise, will disproportionately find themselves in positions of institutional authority. Whether that constitutes influence, and whether influence of that kind is distinguishable in its practical effects from the kind of coordination that the conspiracy theorists describe, is a question that the academic literature has not settled, and that the script you are listening to will not pretend to settle either. What can be said is this: the concern is legitimate. The mechanism is real, even if its deterministic interpretation is not proven. And Schwab's own words in a Harvard lecture hall in 2017 suggest a man who understood perfectly well that what he had built was not merely a conference. It was a network of people who thought in a particular way about the world, placed inside the institutions that governed it. That network became Schwab's life's work. It also became, in the hands of others, his most damning exhibit. The legitimate criticism of the World Economic Forum is not finally very mysterious, and it does not require a conspiracy to state it plainly. Every January, the most powerful unelected institution in the global economy gathers the leaders of the most powerful elected governments and the most powerful corporations in a Swiss mountain town at a meeting funded almost entirely by those corporations, where the sessions are public and the important conversations are private, where the security costs are paid by Swiss taxpayers, and where the delegates arrive on private jets to discuss the planetary emergency those private jets are helping to cause. The institution that hosts this meeting is not accountable to any parliament, any electorate, or any court of international law. It publishes financial statements, but does not disclose which companies pay what. It influences global policy through networks it has built across 30 years without ever having been authorized to do so by a democratic process. This is the argument that Oxfam makes every January in the Inequality Report, at times deliberately to coincide with the forum's opening day, a report placed in the hands of journalists in Davos as a counter-narrative to the official agenda, an act of tactical irony that the WEF, to its credit, does not attempt to suppress. The numbers in those reports are striking, and while economists have raised technical objections to Oxfam's methodology, the directional claim that wealth is concentrating at the top with a speed and completeness that democratic institutions are not managing to constrain is not seriously contested. In the 2025 report, released at the opening of the Davos annual meeting, Oxfam found that global billionaire wealth had grown by 16% in a single year, reaching $18.3 trillion, an all-time high, and that it had grown by 81% since 2020. The world's 12 richest individuals, by that accounting, held more wealth than the bottom half of humanity combined. Billionaires were found to be more than 4,000 times more likely than an ordinary person to hold political office, and the people described in that report were, in many cases, sitting in the rooms where it was being distributed. The private jet figures deserve the same clarity because they are sometimes dismissed as a talking point from people who dislike the WEF rather than as an empirical finding. They are both. Greenpeace's annual surveys of private aviation at airports serving the Davos area use a straightforward methodology, counting flights, and the numbers are what they are. 709 private jet movements in January 2025, a 10% increase on the 628 recorded in 2024, a threefold increase on the 227 recorded in 2023. Greenpeace calculated that approximately 70% of the routes flown were serviceable by train within a day of travel time. The forum that opened with climate crisis on its plenary agenda oversaw, during the same week, a private aviation event of considerable scale. These facts do not prove that the WEF is malevolent. They prove that it is structurally incapable of holding itself to the standard it publicly promotes, and that this incapacity has not, in the years since it has been documented, produced any announced policy of reform. That is the legitimate critique. It is serious. It is supported by data. It is made by researchers, by left-wing NGOs, by economists, by democratic theorists, and by a growing body of academic literature on what institutions like the WEF represent in a world where the formal architecture of international governance has struggled to keep pace with the scale of the problems it is supposed to address. And then there is the other critique, the one that shares some of these observations and draws from them a set of conclusions for which no evidence exists, and which, in its most virulent forms, draws on a tradition of hatred so old and so thoroughly discredited that naming it here is not optional. The conspiracy theory of the World Economic Forum holds in its various versions that Davos is not a forum for discussion, but a command center for execution, that the policies debated in public are covers for policies agreed in private, that the world's governments are not merely influenced by WEF networks, but controlled by them, that the pandemic was not a natural disaster, but a managed event, and that behind all of it, directing the machinery with a purposefulness that the public record of confused and contradictory institutional behavior conspicuously fails to support, is a coordinating intelligence of some kind. Some versions of the theory leave the identity of that intelligence vague. Some specify it. The versions that specify it deploy a vocabulary: global financiers, international banking cabals, the Rothschilds, Soros. That is not, in the context of conspiracy theory history, a neutral set of references. It is a lineage, and the lineage begins not in the 21st century, not even in the 20th, but in a document produced in the late 19th century by the secret police of the Russian Tsar, adapted from an earlier satirical text designed to justify the persecution of Jewish communities and exposed as a forgery in 1921 by a journalist at the Times of London named Philip Graves, who traced the plagiarism source by source. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the foundational text of modern anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the document that established, for mass consumption, the template of the hidden Jewish council secretly governing the world's governments, banks, and media. It was debunked 104 years ago. Its specific claims have been refuted in exhaustive detail by historians on every continent. It is a fabrication. Its quotes were invented. Its meetings never happened. It was manufactured to serve a political purpose, and when that purpose became the Holocaust, the cost of the lie was measured in millions of lives. The WEF, as Jewish global conspiracy framing, is this document's direct descendant. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which researches online extremism, and the Anti-Defamation League, which monitors anti-Semitism, both documented in 2020 and 2021 the explicit use of Great Reset conspiracy content by neo-Nazi and far-right communities to propagate these tropes. The way the WEF's initials, its meeting formats, its membership, and its agenda were systematically reframed using the protocol's template to imply that global elite was a coded phrase for Jewish financial power, and that the Great Reset was the elders' latest plan. The facts do not support this framing in any dimension. The World Economic Forum's founder is German-Swiss and was raised in a Lutheran household. Its membership of approximately 1,000 corporations spans every nationality, religion, and ethnic background represented in the global economy. Its critics range from Oxfam on the left to nationalist parties on the right, and include Muslim-majority governments, East Asian technology companies, and African development economists who object to Western-dominated agenda setting. There is no ethnic or religious uniformity to its leadership, its membership, or its agenda, and no such uniformity would explain the forum's behavior in any case, because the forum's behavior is explained perfectly adequately by the much more mundane dynamic of extremely wealthy and powerful people building and maintaining an institution that serves their interests while persuading themselves and others that it serves everyone's. That is a genuine problem. It does not require a medieval forgery to describe it. The anti-Semitic overlay on the WEF conspiracy is not a marginal phenomenon confined to the darkest corners of the internet. It circulates in mainstream social media channels, in popular podcasts, in political rhetoric, and in the comment sections of videos very much like this one. Naming it and tracing it to its source is not a gesture of political correctness. It is a matter of historical accuracy and of refusing to allow a documented forgery to be laundered through a legitimate political critique. The accountability problems of the World Economic Forum are real. They deserve precise, evidence-based engagement. They do not deserve to be contaminated by a lie that has already been used in living memory to justify mass murder. Klaus Schwab's father ran a factory that used forced labor. That is documented, and it is not trivial. But the version of that history in which Eugen Schwab was Hitler's intimate confidant and his son is carrying forward a Nazi project. That version was examined by fact-checkers at Snopes and PolitiFact and assessed as false, built on documents that did not support the claims made about them, and on at least one photograph that was not of Eugen Schwab at all. A photograph of a Nazi military officer circulated online for years, identified as Klaus Schwab's father. It was not him. The Gestapo monitored the Schwab family during the war years. His mother was arrested for speaking Swiss-German dialect. The reality of Eugen Schwab, a Swiss-affiliated industrialist in Nazi Germany who did broadly what many Swiss-affiliated industrialists in Nazi Germany did, which is to say he participated in the war economy and profited from coerced labor, is a reality serious enough to warrant serious examination. It does not warrant a hoax. What the World Economic Forum actually is then, once the mythology has been set aside and the documented record laid out in its ordinary complexity, is something less dramatic than its enemies claim and considerably less benign than its founders intended. And the distinction between those two positions is, in a way, the entire argument. Schwab himself spent 50 years insisting on the benign interpretation. He became, over that half-century, one of the most recognizable faces in global governance. A small, precise man with a slight German accent and a characteristic collarless tunic jacket that served as a kind of institutional livery, photographed in conversation with a roster of world leaders that reads like a history of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He was genuinely committed to the stakeholder vision. The books he wrote, the speeches he gave, the programs he built, none of them are the work of a man who was cynically exploiting a platform for personal gain or ideological domination. He was, by all available accounts, a true believer in the thing he had made, which made the events of 2224 and 2025 all the stranger to watch. In May of 2024, Schwab stepped back from day-to-day management of the organization he had founded 53 years earlier. The transition was framed publicly as a planned evolution appropriate for a man who was by then 86 years old and had built an institution capable of running without him. In June of the same year, the Wall Street Journal published a report citing allegations of workplace misconduct and harassment against Schwab, drawn from anonymous whistleblower accounts. The WEF denied the allegations, and an initial internal inquiry found no material wrongdoing. In April of 2025, Klaus Schwab resigned as chairman of the World Economic Forum. He was 87 years old. The organization he had built from a 2-week management seminar for 444 people had become, in his lifetime, an institution with a staff of over 800, an annual budget exceeding $250 million francs, and an influence on global policy that no one who attended the first European Management Symposium in 1971 could have imagined. An external investigation commissioned by the WEF, conducted by the Zurich law firm Hamburger and completed in August of 2025, found no evidence of material wrongdoing by Schwab. He filed defamation complaints against the anonymous sources who had provided allegations to journalists. The institution continued. This is how institutions end their founding chapters, usually not with revelation, not with the dramatic collapse that the myth makers had been predicting for 30 years, but with the quiet accumulation of administrative difficulties, personnel transitions, legal proceedings, and organizational inertia. The World Economic Forum without Klaus Schwab is still the World Economic Forum. The Young Global Leaders Network continues to operate. The annual meeting continues to take place in Davos every January. The membership of approximately 1,000 multinational corporations continues to pay its fees. The private jets continue to land. The structural problem that the WEF fills, the vacuum it has occupied for 55 years, has not gone away with its founder's departure, and that structural problem is ultimately the most important thing to understand about it. The global economy produces coordination problems that exceed the capacity of any single national government to solve unilaterally. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, financial system stability, supply chain resilience, the governance of artificial intelligence. These are problems that respect no national border, that require action across jurisdictions, and that existing international institutions, designed in the aftermath of the Second World War for a world of relatively bounded national economies, have not adequately addressed. The United Nations operates by consensus among governments and is structurally unable to compel the behavior of the corporations that are, in many cases, the primary drivers of the problems it is trying to solve. The World Trade Organization has been functionally paralyzed for years. The G7 and G20 produce communiques that are not binding on anyone. Into this institutional gap, the World Economic Forum inserted itself, not by force, not by conspiracy, but by offering something that nothing else was offering. A room where the people who actually ran things, whether they were elected or not, could sit with each other informally, without the constraints of formal diplomatic protocol, without the cameras that would shape their public performances, without the constitutional requirements that would prevent their governments from reaching across jurisdictional lines toward the kinds of agreements that the moment required. Whether that room produces more good than harm is a question that cannot be answered cleanly, and any documentary that tells you it can has chosen its conclusion before examining the evidence. The Greece-Turkey de-escalation of 1988 is a real outcome. Gavi is a real outcome. The UN Global Compact is a real outcome, and against them must be placed the accountability deficit of an institution that influences global governance without being accountable to the people most affected by it. The structural conflict of interest in an institution where corporate money funds access to political leaders who regulate those corporations. And the private jet problem, which is not merely a matter of optics, but of an institution that has arrogated to itself a moral authority on the subject of the planet's future, while being demonstrably unable to constrain the behavior of its own delegates on a question of elementary symbolism. There is a serious argument made by democratic theorists and development economists and international law scholars that institutions like the WEF represent not a solution to the deficit of global governance, but a deepening of it. That by providing a private, informal, unaccountable venue for the coordination of powerful actors, they reduce the pressure on formal democratic institutions to develop the binding international frameworks that actually solving these problems would require. If the finance ministers of the world's major economies can coordinate informally at IGWEL and reach a working consensus on interest rate policy before any public announcement, they have also reduced the space in which that coordination is subject to democratic scrutiny, parliamentary debate, or the input of the constituencies most affected by those decisions. This is not a fringe position. It is published in peer-reviewed journals. It is the position of development economists at institutions like Oxfam. It is the position of democratic theorists who have spent careers studying the relationship between informal elite networks and the formal institutions of democratic governance. It is also, notably, a position that has nothing to do with secret societies, ancient bloodlines, manufactured pandemics, or the protocols of the elders of Zion. It is a position that requires only the documented evidence to make, evidence that the World Economic Forum itself has provided in its financial reports and its membership lists and its published meeting agendas, and the gap between those agendas and the conversations that happen in the private rooms above them. The Bilderberg Group, which was founded in 1954 and meets annually at rotating locations in Europe and North America, operates with far greater secrecy than the WEF. No public agenda, no live stream sessions, no journalists admitted under any credential, no published attendee list of its own composition. Attendance leaked and reconstructed each year by researchers working from external sources. It is frequently confused with the WF in popular media, and the confusion serves no one. The two institutions are distinct in their origins, their formats, their membership, and their modes of operation, and conflating them produces only a vague, undifferentiated sense of elite conspiracy that fits neither institution accurately. Similarly, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1973, and the various governmental coordination formats of the G7 and G20 are distinct institutions with distinct histories and distinct functions. The habit of collapsing all of them into a single globalist cabal is analytically useless and historically illiterate. Each of them deserves its own account, and each of them raises its own specific questions about power and accountability that are obscured rather than illuminated by the merger. The World Economic Forum is the most visible of these networks, the most public, the most lavishly documented, the most theatrically staged, and that visibility is, in one sense, its greatest vulnerability. It has provided the imagery, the quotations, the architecture of a conspiracy theory that it did not invent and cannot control. The image of world leaders filing into a Swiss mountain town protected by snipers on rooftops while private jets stack up over the Alps is genuinely striking. It is genuinely strange. It does not require embellishment. The embellishments that have been added, the microchips, the depopulation plans, the ethnic attributions, have buried the strangeness that was actually there, the documented strangeness of what an unelected institution funded by corporations actually does with the access it has accumulated over 55 years. That is the version of this story that will not get the clicks. It is less satisfying than the conspiracy, because it does not resolve into a villain with a clear plan, and because it requires holding two things simultaneously. The WF is not a shadow world government, and the WEF does exercise a form of influence over global governance that is not authorized by any democratic process, and both of those things are true at the same time. All of these descriptions contain some truth. None contains the whole of it. In the end, you are left with the image that started this story. A Congress center in a Swiss mountain town, snow on the ground, a 32-year-old German economist standing in front of 444 people explaining a theory of how businesses should relate to society. No snipers, no jets, no heads of state. A modest proposal, offered modestly, in a language that most of the attendees would have found slightly unfamiliar. Whether Klaus Schwab knew what he was beginning, whether he intended from the first to build something that would eventually claim the power to penetrate the cabinets of the world's governments, is not a question the record can answer. What the record shows is that he spent 50 years building it with methodical, unhurried consistency, expanding its membership and broadening its scope, and deepening its networks year by year, until the modest symposium had become an institution whose annual convening required the deployment of the Swiss Army, whose private meetings shaped global policy in ways that were never fully visible to the public, and whose name had become, for millions of people who had never read a word of what it actually produced, a symbol of everything they feared and distrusted about the world they lived in. He built something that the world needed, or thought it needed, and the need did not make it safe from the uses that power always finds for the rooms that gather it. The 5,000 troops, and the restricted airspace, and the holographic badges, and the private jets, and the Iguel sessions closed to cameras. None of that was in the circular letters mailed from Geneva in the winter of 1971. All of it is in Davos now. The Congress Center is still there. Every January, the mountain fills again. And somewhere in the gap between the first meeting and the 55th, between the modest educational seminar and the machine that replaced it, is the question that every serious account of the World Economic Forum has to face. At what point does influence become power, and at what point does power require consent? That question has not been answered. It may be that asking it openly and precisely, with the documented record in hand and the mythology set aside, is the most honest contribution any account of Davos can make. If you want more buried histories like this one, subscribe. There's a new one every week.